Good afternoon. To all those who are here, I hope you have had an energizing and a communicative lunch break. To our remote participants, welcome back also. Welcome back to our first afternoon slot. It's called Education as a Noisy Signal, How to Build Robust Predictions from Grades Using Context Data, Econometrics, and AI. If you have worked with TNG before or collaborated with us, you will be aware that we have a very high academia rate. 99.9% of our employees have an academic background. And the most common subject is physics. And with myself belonging to a minority of real computer scientists, the question, are physicists the smartest thinkers, could become quite a personal one at times, such an environment. But today's topic is not so much about quabbling or anecdotal approaches, it's about hard facts, numbers, and empirics. We have an expert speaker for that. Dr. Philipp Seegers is a labor economist, and he's also the founder of CASE, which is short for Candidate Select. And what CASE do is that they develop methods that can put academic achievements, such as grades, into context and translate them into reliable signals. And at the same time, Dr. Seegers is also a research fellow at Maastricht University. Before we start, let me allow you one organizational remark. We will have a slot for questions at the end, so please keep your questions until then. And with that, I welcome our speaker. The stage is yours.
Thank you. I'm really glad to see that the room is quite full. This is probably the least AI presentation of the day. I mean, I put it in the title, and it already served its purpose because you're all here. In that sense, it worked. Yeah, I'm Philipp. I'm a research fellow at Maastricht University, and I'm also founder of CASE. CASE started a decade ago as a research project, and since then we slowly transformed into being somewhat of a real company. We develop algorithms to screen education, but also job experience, and we help our clients to automate recruitment, not just in terms of making the processes more efficient, but also in terms of making them better from a diagnostic perspective. Okay, yeah, I'm an economist, so I'm a social scientist. It's a truth that I have to face. I don't like it, but it's the way it is. And I want to start this presentation by sort of giving you a feel what data in social science actually means, because I think most of you, or a lot of you, might have a background in physics, as we just learned. And the presentation is titled Education as a Noisy Signal, and I think we have a fundamentally different perception of what noise in data can actually be. So here we have an example right from what I want to talk about. We have cognitive ability, we have GPA, the grade point average, so the average grade that you obtain in your education. And here the line explains everything perfectly, right? We have an R square of 1, everything is explained, and that's of course not the truth. Maybe you can raise your hands when you think we are reaching the truth. So I'm gonna make some noise now, and maybe you can tell me when you think we made it to the true picture. Yeah, now we're there. So that's what we're dealing with, okay? So the correlation between cognitive ability and GPAs is around 0.22 to 3 to 4, depending on the studies that you look at. If you square that, we can explain roughly 6 to 7% of the differences in grades. We can explain them with cognitive ability. And that's really not a lot, right? So we're really dealing with something here that is super noisy, something that you probably didn't experience in a sort of experimental physics design or something. We have really, really noisy data, and that makes it quite complicated, and we have to come up with a couple of tools. So That's the relationship between cognitive ability and GPA. Of course, we're not interested in GPAs, we're interested in performance later in the labor market. So these are two studies that we did, one with Mahle and one with Simon-Kucher, a consultancy as well. And with them, we looked at how well does the GPA of the people they hire, how well does that correlate with the job performance they show on the job after being hired. And here with Mahle, it was a performance evaluation. With Simon-Kucher, it's about timely promotions. So we have two different outcomes for job performance. But you see the lines even slope in the wrong direction, right? The ones with the bad grades, they showed better job performance. And that's not what we would find in big meta studies. In big meta studies, we usually find a correlation of around 0.1. So we can explain 1% of the differences in job performance. We can explain them with grades. 1%. That's not a lot, right? That sort of doesn't make a strong case that when hiring people, you should look at grades. If you can explain 1% of the sort of differences later on. Of course, it's always hard to predict humans, but that's not what we want. What we see here, even going in the wrong direction, that's probably because of selection. And we'll talk about all these limitations, but it's not random to be hired at a company, right? They usually hire the good ones. And if you're being hired despite bad grades, you probably bring something to the table that is really cool, right? That's not education. Some cool job experience or anything else. So the people with the bad grades here, they were hired despite their bad grades, meaning that they probably show something else, which then leads to this negative relationship here that we find quite frequently in real life data. But of course, in reality, there's like a tiny positive relationship in the sense that, yes, people with better grades, they do show better job performance, but it's tiny, right? So what does predict success? And this should be a bit humbling because these two studies that I have here are two big meta-analyses. They're really state-of-the-art. They're the most quoted meta-analyses in the field. And the task here is to predict job performance of people. And what you see as variables here is, for one, cognitive ability. I think that's pretty clear. It's intelligence measured with a standardized test. But then you also find personality traits here. And maybe as a sort of short detour, it's quite interesting how these personality traits come around, because what psychologists did in the 1960s is they asked lots of questions to people. We call it the lexical approach. So they asked lots of statements, and the people had to say whether these statements apply to them or not. Right? So they just said applies very well, doesn't apply, and then you have like a data set where you ask them a couple of hundred statements, and what they then did is they did a PCA. They did a factor analysis in order to come up with dimensions. And that's very analytical. Naming the dimensions is then a bit more anecdotal, right? I mean, at some point you then see which statements are grouped together by the model, and you give the dimension a name. But that's what we do here. So we have openness to experience. We have extroversion. I think these two are quite self-explanatory. Emotional stability. Conscientiousness is whether you like to be on time. There are probably lots of Germans here. It's Gewissenhaftigkeit in German. That might help your understanding. And then we have agreeableness. And all of these things are relevant for job performance. But if we take it all together, we can probably explain, and these are correlations again, right? We can probably explain 30 to 40% if we do a really good job, right? If you do the best job at assessing people, you can explain 30 to 40% of the differences in job performance later on. That's you doing an excellent job. Most companies are not doing an excellent job on this. And that should humble ourselves, right? We're never going to get to a point where we can perfectly explain whether someone's going to be performing well or not performing well on the job. But still, there's a strong business case to this, right? I mean, I'm an economist, and if you can explain 30 to 40% of the differences, there's probably a good business case to hire those people that will, on average, exhibit stronger performance than the ones that, at least in your expectation, won't. But I have different studies here. So in green, we have a study that looks at salespeople, right? So it's a sort of narrow study that only looks at people who work in a sales job. And then we have the two big meta-analyses here. And what I want to show you is the picture is quite similar, right? Cognitive ability seems to be the strongest driver of job performance. Conscientiousness seems to be a big one, right? Extroversion is more important for sales jobs than for your average job, which makes a lot of sense. But you see that the meta-analyses, they also disagree a lot, right? So there's quite a range from 0.5 to 0.3 in terms of the correlation, 9% versus 25% of variation explained, quite a difference. So where are those differences coming from? And I think this is the perfect moment to introduce to you the elite four of social science problems. So where is all our noise coming from? And the first one is really not that scary, it's random error, right? If you look at one exam, one test, maybe one interview, of course, there's more random error in there because you might have a good day, you might have a bad day, you might have prepared certain topics for the exam, and then you can get lucky that these topics will be part of the exam or not. So if you sort of look at single measurements, this random error becomes a problem. But when we look at education, it's a long-term estimate, right? So random error is really not the one that's the main cause of problems here. But we have more. We have bad measurement. The things that we're trying to measure when we think about personality or cognitive ability, these are latent variables. It's not something that you can measure with a satisfying experimental design, right? It's more of a concept, an idea. And then of course we have ways to measure it, but whatever way we measure it, we're always going to have measurement error, right? In many, many situations, for example, it can also be self-reported. If we think about education, this is usually self-reported data in big studies. And of course, there's measurement error in self-reported data. So that's a big one. Even bigger, selection. Not everyone is getting hired at a company. Not everyone is deciding to get an education, to get a PhD, to get a certain degree. So there's a lot of selection in there, and that's really strongly driving the results. If you think about a super competitive study program, the ones studying in that program, of course, they're going to learn a lot, but they were already super smart at the beginning, right? So if you look at the outcomes, is it because they learned a lot, or is it because they were selected strongly in a way that they were already smart from the beginning? That one is a big one. And the last one, omitted variable bias, probably the only one some people might not have heard about. I give you a very simple example. If you think about ice cream sales and the people that drown every year, there will be a strong relationship between the two. Like in the month when they sell a lot of ice cream, a lot of people will drown. And of course, the causal effect will be rather small, right? I mean, if you eat a lot of ice cream, at some point you'll have a higher risk of a heart attack while swimming, and there will be some causal channel here. But the main driver is an omitted variable. It's the weather, right? When it's sunny, people eat ice cream. When it's sunny, people go swimming. And when they go swimming, there's a higher risk of drowning. When more people go swimming, more people will drown. And that's an omitted variable. So, and that's a big problem, because if we look at things like education, we can't look at it in a vacuum, but there will be other variables that influence education, but they will also influence your job performance later on in the labor market. And those are really the 4 problems that we will keep with us for the remainder of the presentation, and we have to keep them in mind. And that's also what drives the big differences between these 2 meta-analyses, because essentially they're trying to answer 2 different questions. The Schmidt-Hunter study answers more of the question, what is the correlation between this theoretical idea of cognitive ability, intelligence, and later outcomes. So they, for example, they correct for measurement error. But in reality, you can't really correct for measurement error that well, because you cannot test and retest and retest and retest your applicants like 3 or 4 times, because that's just a very awkward recruitment process, right? So we're very limited in terms of the corrections that we can do in real life. But then there are other things that they do, especially Schmidt-Hunter, they do much more correction, and that's what sort of this nerd debate in psychology is about. Not a psychologist, just stealing stuff here. But the other thing is selection, and it's what we call range restriction. So if we look at, it's all simulated data, but I try to simulate it in a way that it's fitting. So again, cognitive ability is around 107, because if you look at the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and then norming study, you'll see that students that go into higher education, they are above the average in intelligence. So normally intelligence is centered around 100 with a 15 standard deviation. Here it's 107 with a somewhat slightly narrower standard deviation. And that could be the full picture, right? But now, when we're looking at job performance, we can only judge the job performance of the people that were actually hired, right? So we can't judge it for everyone, meaning that if we try to select the smartest people, this is more like the data that we will look at, right? So some observations, the not so smart people, they'll be dropped because you don't observe them, and so you don't get outcome variables for them because they weren't hired. And the slope doesn't change so much, it changes a bit, but what you can really see is that the correlation drops, right? The share of what you can explain in the data is just so much smaller. So here we have 0.5, and now we just drop a couple of people and the correlation will directly go down to 0.18. And that's really why, in my opinion, it does make some sense to correct for range restrictions, because this selection is otherwise driving all correlations towards 0 very, very quickly. Okay, but another detour. This is also something that's strongly driving prejudices that we might have. So I often hear, it's not true, but I often hear smart people are socially awkward, right? Something that I guess some of you in the room might have heard that stereotype before, right? And It's not true in reality. There's even a tiny positive correlation. So if you're intelligent, you'll be less socially awkward. You have more social competence, but it's really small. So for the sake of the argument, let's just assume there's nothing, okay? These two things have nothing to do with each other. It's just a random scatter, no correlation between being smart and being socially capable. But where's the stereotype coming from? Well, of course, it's coming from we like fairness, right? If someone's smart and then they're also good at other stuff, we just, as humans, we think it's unfair. So there's some tendency within us to sort of balance things out, right? And it's very hard to accept that some people are just good at everything. It makes you look bad, and it's very frustrating. And I personally also don't like it. But it's again, you can also explain why this is driven by selection, because who are the people that you observe, for example, in your job, in the labor market? On average, these will be the people that either have some cognitive ability or some social skills, right? If you're low on cognitive ability and low on social skills, it's much less likely that you will encounter these people in your job, in your profession, in your day-to-day life, because they're just underrepresented in most functions. And once you take them out, and then we apply the very scientific visual fit method here, you get a very robust negative correlation, even though there's none, right? It's all driven by selection again. And this is why this is actually quite a big problem, and we need to keep it in mind, because if you just look at the data that you have, it might be perfectly reasonable to assume that these two constructs are negatively correlated, even though they are not. So this is not true. And if someone says it's true, give them my number, and I'll have a lengthy discussion with them and annoy them with selection effects and all this kind of stuff. Okay, back to the topic. Back to education. We have a job interview here, and the recruiter, the boss, asks, "Why should I hire you?" And the guy says, "Well, I graduated from Harvard." Why should I care? And now there's two possible answers, right? You could say, "Well, I learned a lot of stuff." That's one thing you do in education, you learn a lot of stuff. And if you went to Harvard, probably you learned a lot of stuff. And that's what we call in economics, you would call that human capital. In the sort of HR, recruitment space, you would call it skills, right? I can do a lot of things. And then the other thing you can answer is, well, only smart people can do that. And that's not really related to that you learned something, it's just related to it's hard, right? Even if it's completely irrelevant what you learn at Harvard, it's still hard to do. So the people that manage to do it, they signal to you that they have something special, that they have certain abilities, that they can do certain things that others maybe can't, because not everyone graduates Harvard. Getting in already is a huge hurdle, right? And these are really the two arguments for education. We have, for one, you learn stuff, you accumulate human capital, you get skills, but also you signal your own ability. And then there's the whole field. I say I'm a labor economist. In labor economics, there's the field of education economics. So if you want to be very precise, I'm an education economist. And then there's a lot of debate on how much is education? I mean, we're economists after all, right? So what's the return? Is it worth it? If I enroll in education, I do this for a couple of years. Some people like it, so if you like it, it's always good. Then it's fun, and you don't have to worry about the return. But if you don't really like it, you should think about the return. And also the government should think about the return, because they're putting lots of subsidies into education. So it's really important to, that's one of the most central questions in education economics. Is it worth it? What's the return of education? And I put it here, it's 8%. But to get there is actually quite a journey. It took us a while, and a couple of people got Nobel Prizes for it along the way. But let's keep things simple for the beginning. We have education, normally measured in years of schooling, and we'll have to talk about that as well. And then we have outcomes, salary, wage, right? Money. Not the perfect outcome, but we have to live with what we can get. And the easiest thing you can do is you can make a simple regression and regress education on the outcomes, OLS regression, ordinary least squares, and you get an estimate. And that estimate is actually quite close to the 8%. But there are problems. There are multiple problems in there. So, of course, that's the first thing that people did. And then economists are also smart asses. Everyone was complaining about this, like, it's not going to work. This is not causal, because there's ability, right? And I mean, for one measurement error, we can't really measure ability very well. But then, of course, ability is related to education. There's selection. Smart people get more education than not so smart people. If you're smart, it's easier to learn, it's less investment, right? Smart people get more education than not so smart people. So there's selection in there. And now we also have an omitted variable bias, because being smart also has a payoff in the labor market. And now when we regress education against the outcomes, it will pick up this ability effect, right? Even if education doesn't mean anything, smart people will still enroll in education more frequently, meaning that if people with high education earn more money, it doesn't necessarily have to be related to the education at all. It can just be related to the fact that they were smarter in the first place. And that's why everyone thought this is strongly upward biased. The return to education must be much lower than 8%. This is too high. And now it's interesting to think about how can we solve this. And this is where the literature got me really excited back in the day, because there's different approaches, but the general gist is we have to find an instrument, and we have to find something that's related to the education that someone's getting, but that's not related to the ability that someone has. And by having such an instrument, we can create a clear channel, because we're not going to use the actual education, we're going to use the estimated education. And I'm going to talk about examples for such instruments in a second. But by estimating education through something that's unrelated to ability, we can establish a causal channel. We can get something that's exogenous from ability. And this two-step estimation, it's called instrumental variable regression, really cool stuff, gives you unbiased estimates for these kind of causal effects. It's super inefficient though, right? Because we're not using the actual education, but we're using the estimated education. You need huge sample size, and normally these models are not very robust unless you have a lot of data. But still, it's very cool. And I'm going to give you some examples what people use, because it's not so easy to come up with such an instrument. And one example is twin studies. If you look at twins, usually their abilities can be assumed to be similar, right? Especially if they were raised in the same family. You probably expect them to sort of be very, very similar, at least in their genetic ability. And if one person is then successful and the other one is not, and they have there's variation in the education that they obtained for some reason, then you can use that to get causal estimates for the return to education. Something else that people did was mandatory schooling requirements. In some US states, you can leave high school at the age of 16. So the day you turn 16, you don't have to go anymore. And some people do that. So they look at people who dropped out at 16, but of course everyone turns 16 at a different point in time in the school year. So just by the randomness of when you were born, some people will have slightly more education than the others, right? If you only look at the people who drop out with 16. And that also gives you one of these clean channels. Another thing is distance to school. It's been shown that it's not very strong, it's very inefficient, but it works. If you live closer to university, you have a higher chance of attending that university. You have a higher chance of going to school. So again, you have something that is related to the education that you're getting, and I already see some faces. You can also make up that it's also related to the ability, right? Because who lives close to university? The kids of the professors, right? Maybe they have higher ability. Nothing in here is perfect. Everything is up to debate. But that's also an instrument that people use, and I also used this in my master thesis to see whether people who are in a more international education setting, whether that has additional returns. So the idea is that if you are getting educated at a more international setting, you learn from other cultures, from other people, you obtain more language skills, you're in a more competitive environment. There's multiple arguments that you can make why international education is a bit better than purely domestic education. And that's something that we used. It worked, but as I said, it's not very robust. We had to put it on the pile of stuff that we didn't publish. And the last thing is education reform. It's not an instrument, but it's also very nice because it produces exogenous variation. In Germany, for example, we had, I don't think there's enough old people here, but we had a Kurzschuljahr in Germany, so a shortened school year. And just by design, people got less education. And of course, there's other education reforms in other countries, and you can really use that because suddenly people are getting more or less education because of this reform, not because of their ability or anything, just because the rules changed. There's going to be lots of COVID studies on this in a couple of years. I mean, the people haven't reached the labor market yet. They're still in education, most of them. But we're going to see that there's a huge loss in terms of wage because you lost education. Because education has a return. When COVID hit, people got less education, and that will punish them for the rest of their lives. 8% per year. It's not going to be a small punishment. Yeah, so these are the things that people did. And then to the big surprise of all the economists involved, we didn't overestimate with the OLS regression. We rather underestimated slightly. So the causal effect was even a bit higher than what we assumed in those simple models. And there's two main drivers behind that. Measurement error again, right? If you're just being present, not looking at anyone particular here, if you're just being present, you have more years of education, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you learned something, that you demonstrated something, or that there should be a causal effect. So when we talk about the return to education, we shouldn't just think about the return to being in education for a certain amount of time, but we should think of it as a function of time and quality, right? And that's a measurement problem. And there's an exercise. How much time do I have? I'm still fine, right? Cool. So I can take another detour. So there's an exercise in economics, and we call it growth accounting. And in growth accounting, you sort of look at why economies grow in the very, very long term, right? Short term, it's all about capital accumulation and saving and buying more machines and investing and all of that. And that makes you grow in the sort of also long term, but short long term, let's put it that way. But at some point, you reach steady state, how we call it, right? All the capital is accumulated. Of course, some capital is depreciated. The old machines, you don't need them anymore, so you need to buy new machines. But the capital stock per person, per capita, it's not really growing anymore. And then the question is, why do economies grow in steady state? And the answer to that is always technological progress. I mean, we just had a Nobel Prize in economics given to people who looked at this innovation process and endogenized it in the models. That's what the guys were given the Nobel Prize for like 2 weeks ago. So this is a big thing. And these growth accounting exercises, they become much, much better if you don't just look at the length people spend in education in a certain country and sort of try to explain the growth of economies of certain countries with that. But instead of using the length of education, you use educational outcomes like PISA data or something for like that, right? So you look at the sort of the outcomes of education, how much do the people actually learn? And suddenly the estimates for education become much and much larger. And that's the reason why I became an education economist, because I had a course on productivity and long-run growth, and I was fascinated by the fact that this is sort of what drives growth in the long term. People sort of getting educated, people doing research, not just in public universities and all of that, but also private companies. R&D, it's also super important. That's also what causes the main decline in growth and innovation in the last years. It's mainly companies doing less. Also, we're very good in Europe, very good at basic research, like coming up with new ideas and new concepts. We're not that good at sort of getting that research into the economy. And so it's really both. But once you sort of get at the core to it, education becomes one of the strongest drivers for economic growth in the long run. And I think that's really cool and fascinating. But plus, I was super bored by financial markets, but that's a different. And the other thing is, and that's why it's really important that economists also look at education and not just other professions, there's decreasing marginal returns, right? The more you do of something, the more you consume of something, the return will go down after a while. And I mean, at the beginning, you learn how to write and how to, you learn languages, you learn like basic calculus. These things are objectively very useful in your daily life, right? When you think about the stuff that you learned at university, maybe in your PhD, I think everyone can come up with a couple of things that are completely irrelevant to what they're doing these days, right? You probably learned some stuff that's not that helpful. And the longer you stay in education, the less useful the stuff usually gets, right? But then there's also, and that's important, there's opportunity cost, right? The time you're spending in education, you're not working. And if you're not working, you can't get a return. So, I mean, there's this concept of lifelong learning, and we always think it's nice. No, it's not a good idea. We shouldn't learn our entire life. At some point, we have to be productive. And to be productive, we have to work. And that's why it's probably not even looking like that. It might even look like this. So the return to education, of course, it can turn negative after a while. And what we see is that the people... what I'm trying to explain is underestimation, right? So this is, the first one was measurement error in the X variable, but this one is the people who are very smart, they spend more time in education, some of them maybe too much time in education. And that's also driving down the returns. And that's why once we get causal estimates through these models, we found out that it's actually quite close. So now I talked for 20 minutes to tell you that we're back to the 8% that we already had on the previous slide, but I hope at least it was an interesting story about how we can get causal estimates and how everyone thought this 8% is far too high, and then they figured out, well, it's maybe even slightly too low. And one more little fun fact, the social return in this growth accounting exercise, the social return is even higher than the 8%. So it does make sense to subsidize education. It does make sense as a government to invest in education. There's different models, especially with higher education in sort of mainland Europe. The state is paying for it. In Anglo-Saxon countries, people are paying for it individually. But given that the social return is even higher than the private return, it does make sense as a government to invest there heavily. And then, of course, the rest is politics. But let's get back to this. I mean, we say it's 8%, and it's driven by skills, by human capital accumulation, and it's driven by the signal. So let's disambiguate the two a bit, right? Sort of how smart we are, how motivated we are, how conscientious we are. That's all what I call ability. And the skills is sort of what we learn, the concrete skills. And there's different definitions for this. I'm not saying that this is the right definition. It's just the definition that I use most of the time. And the two are related, right? Ability over time leads to skills, right? If you're very smart, over time you learn new things. And that's, I think, something no one is going to fight me on. But the other thing is also important. If you look at those studies like Schmidt-Hunter and all these things, you'll see that ability is more predictive than skills. So what you currently know is less predictive of your success in the labor market than your innate ability. And the reason for that is that skills depreciate. I mean, if you think about what do I need to know in 10 years, you probably don't know that stuff yet, right? It hasn't been invented. I mean, we talk about AI a lot. Most of the stuff, I don't know, depending on how old you are, you didn't learn about that in school, right? I didn't learn about that in school. So ability is more predictive than skills, and that's quite important because ability is what helps you to sort of develop new skills in the future, but it also is something that allows you to solve new problems. It's something that keeps you motivated, and all these things, it's a broad concept. So at the moment, when we sort of look at what's hot in the recruitment bubble, a lot of people are talking about skills, and I always think it's important to keep this in mind, right? We talk about skills a lot, we should be talking about ability more. But why are we talking about skills so much? Because it got so easy these days, right? This is a very stupid exercise that I did. I talked to ChatGPT, I said, create me a skill taxonomy. That's the skill taxonomy. Then I copy-pasted my own LinkedIn profile, and then ChatGPT told me how skillful I am. This is stupid, right? I'm a bit disappointed with my technical skills. I think my business skills are strongly exaggerated, and self-management, certainly not true. But it's very easy, right? And as a company, you get a CV of someone, you put the CV through a large language model, predict me the skills, and it's going to do it. Why do I think it's a dull exercise? Because it's self-reported, right? The stuff you put on your CV, it's self-reported. It's not measured skills. In education, we at least test the skills. But here, it's just people saying, I have 5 out of 5 stars in Git, whatever that means. So that's a problem, right? And of course, there's also lots of bias associated to that. So we know, for example, that men are much more optimistic about their own skill set than women. And we also know that business students are more extrovert and also much more confident about their skills than physics students, for example. So we're not going to get the most accurate image by just looking at self-reported skills. It's fun, it's a little exercise, but I think we're completely overdoing it. This is the hottest thing at the moment. Like all the systems they introduced, they have they want to put AI in, and that's the first thing they came up with. Okay, so I said we should care more about ability, not so much about skills. Why don't we just test the ability? Right? There's cognitive ability test. Of course, it's hard to do. Why don't we just test it? When we think about personality, it is by definition also self-reported, right? And in a personality test, you will be asked questions, statements like, I insult people, or I'm often sad. And when you're in a hiring situation, I don't think you're very likely to answer these statements truthfully. It's just not what people usually do. I mean, you don't want to tell your future boss that I'm going to insult you in the future because that's just who I am. I'm low on agreeableness. Live with it. You're not going to get hired, right? But the saving grace was always cognitive ability. Cognitive ability is the strongest predictor, and it's the one where you can, historically at least, cheat the hardest. You can make yourself more stupid, but you can't make yourself smarter, right? If you have sort of a cognitive ability test, intelligence test, you can't make yourself better. Of course, that's not true. When I was in university and some of my friends were invited to online assessment centers, we would always gather with like 5, 6 people, and then we would ace the shit out of the online assessment together, and everyone always got an interview, and of course that works. But nowadays, you don't even need friends anymore, right? Who needs friends? Just take AI. And I'm not an expert on large language models in the way that you are. And if you put me in a different room, I'm probably the expert on large language models again. But these models are not trained for abstract pattern induction. So if you think about like an intelligence item, Raven matrix, like these matrix things, you have like the thing, and then there's one missing, and you sort of have to figure out what fits in there, right? And there's different logic, exclusive OR, you have to rotate, and all these things. This is not what the models were trained for, and still they're sort of outperforming the average human. We did some tests. They're already as smart as I am. They're not as smart as my co-founder yet, but it's really hard, right? So you can only identify brilliance. All the rest is sort of blurry because people can use AI for these things. My argument is it's getting increasingly difficult to measure ability directly, right? Because of AI, because of these things, but also it's effortful, right? I mean, you look at people, they maybe spent already 6 years in education, and still you're looking at like a cognitive ability test that in the recruitment setting usually is done online and like 30 minutes long. So I think it's quite easy to understand why this is not the best and most robust measure that you can get, even though in theory ability is a very strong driver. It's just measurement error, latent, it's hard to measure. So to make good decisions, we need something that allows us to judge long-term performance, right? I mean, when you're hired, it's not about performance on one specific day, but sort of long-term performance in your job also. So we need something that's as close as possible to that. Ideally, we need something, why have the discussion? Ideally, we have something that just measures both, right? Ability and skills. And we need something that's assessed under supervision, because there will be more on-premise testing also with companies and recruitment in the next years. And well, yeah, the education, big surprise, that's education, right? All of the criteria I just made up myself, education fulfills them. So in theory, it's really good, but now we have to stay realistic. GPAs explain 1% of differences in job performance, right? So it sounds good in theory, but in practice it completely fails. And that's not because it's bad by design, but that's because it's super noisy. We're not all going to the same university. We're not all studying the same subject. There's so much differences in the whole system, and that's the problem. And that's exactly what we do at CASE. We collect a lot of data to solve these things, to make it a bit better. So here we have Sarah and we have Pedro. And Sarah has both are computer scientists, right? Sarah is from Portugal. She got a bachelor degree in computer science, graduated in 2022, and she has a GPA of 13.5. I assume you're all very familiar with the Portuguese grading system. That's why I'm telling you that it ranges from 10, which is the lowest passing grade, to 20. So 10 is the lowest passing grade, 20 is the highest. 13.5 doesn't really look that good, right? It's quite close to the lowest passing grade. But yeah, most people are probably familiar with the German scale. So now we have Pedro. He's studied for his master's degree at the University of Kassel. Also computer science, graduated 1 year earlier with a GPA of 1.7. Looks quite good, right? One is for the non-Germans. No, not good enough. We're not going to get into grade inflation unless you ask me about it in the questions. One being the best and 4 being the worst passing grade, this looks better than the 13.5 in comparison. At least that's what most people would say. But keep in mind, GPAs, they don't explain a lot here. We even have different grading systems. So what will we do at CASE? He wants you to pick him, but let's see about that. So what we collect at CASE is first we collect grading data, because grades only make sense if you're being compared to the people who write the same exams. As soon as you write a different exam, you have a different comparison group, you have a different professor, you have a different grading standard, you have a different degree of grade inflation, and it gets really, really tricky, right? So we collect a lot of data on grading so that we actually know how people were graded at a certain university, in a certain subject, in a certain year, and all of that. That's the first thing, to sort of make local comparisons. The second thing is, not all universities are the same, right? If you average at Harvard, it's something else than if you average at some school we all never heard about. There's different degrees of selectivity. There's different degrees of performance, of competition in those programs. So here we use a lot of data on student performance, ideally testing data, that allows us to understand how able the students are in certain contexts, right? So you can test for that. In many countries, this is how we assign study programs. The German discussion is always about Abitur grades, and of course they are super noisy themselves. Most of the countries in the world have like a university entrance exam, right? That's standardized, everyone's doing the same exam. As a system that feels much better. If you think about Gaokao in China or SAT tests in the US and all of that. A lot of discussion about these things as well, but general, this data really helps you to sort of understand how competitive certain programs are. And if you put the two together and then you think a bit about weighing, right? How important is local performance versus the benchmarking of a certain context? Is it actually better to be average at a good school or good at an average school, right? These things you can really train for it if you have some data. And that's what we do. And the result is a CASE score. So let's go back to Sarah and Pedro. And what we see is that Sarah, the 13.5, that's how they grade at her university. This is top 20%. She's in the best fifth of students in her program. Even though the system theoretically goes to 20, Portugal hasn't exhibited the degrees of grade inflation that other countries have shown historically. So 13.5, actually quite good. And even some countries, if we think about France and Belgium, they have exactly the same grading system, but they use it completely different. And this leads to all kinds of absurd findings. People from Portugal, they will never get a spot for a master program in Germany because they'll never meet the numerus clausus condition, because we normally convert these grades linearly on the scale. So we say the worst grade is 10, 10 is the 4, best grade is 20, 20 is the 1, and then we just do a linear conversion, and they don't even have to apply. Whereas people in Italy, they had huge grade inflation, even worse than the US. Almost everyone gets perfect grades. They can study everything, because if you do a linear conversion on their system, they always meet the numerus clausus easily. So this is important, right? She was already very good locally, but then if you benchmark the school, it's not the best school, but it's actually quite good, right? To come up with the example, I asked ChatGPT, what's the castle of Portugal? That's how I that's how I came up with it. Whereas Pedro, yeah, a lot of grade. So your suspicion was absolutely right. A lot of grade inflation, right? He's even below average with 1.7. They dish out the good grades very, very easily. And then Kassel is also not, I hope no one from Kassel is here, but Kassel is not the most competitive school for computer science. So we would put Sarah in the best 24% and Pedro rather in the bottom 20%. Just looking at the education and putting the education into context with all the data that we collected. And that's our product. That's what we provide to companies so that they can have a better estimate of the sort of performance that people revealed that they showed in education. Okay. You almost made it. I get the 5 minutes already, perfectly in time. I have two more little fun slides, because you already promised that we shed some light on the physics versus computer science discussion. Yeah, okay, he's not happy. No, one more slide on validity, because this is the scoring and it kind of makes sense. But if we take the same studies, Mahler and Simon-Kucher, where grades really even went in the wrong direction, and we contextualize grades with our scoring, we get really robust estimates of the future performance of the people that go in the right direction. It's not perfect. I said we should be humble, right? We can't perfectly predict job performance, but this is as good as it gets. And this is also the moment where we decided to sort of step out of the role as researchers and thought, well, maybe we should start a company, something we hadn't planned initially. Yeah, so that works really well. And there's also, we can repeat that slide. Now it's not sales jobs, but it's correlation with K-score. Not grades, K-score to measure education. And we see that education is quite similar. So it's not just skill-driven, but education is actually quite a good signal for the ability of people, right? People who are really good in education, the strongest driver is also cognitive ability. But it looks quite similar. Education is not that different from working. It's a different context, not everything is the same. Openness is more important in education. Same direction, but more important, right? Extroversion is more important in the labor market. But sort of the direction is the same, and it looks quite similar. That's the theoretical underpinning why it pays off to look at education. If you do this with grades, it's not going to work that well. So now to the fun slides. We test a lot of people, so I just looked at cognitive skills, how well people perform in a cognitive skill test. I tried to put it on the IQ scale, which makes it easier to understand, but is slightly unscientific, right? So this is just for demonstration purposes, because I didn't do a validated IQ test. I did an online cognitive test. It's a good one, but still. Mathematics is better than physics, right? And medicine is even in between. Very strong selection in medicine. It's very hard to get in. So the people that do get in, super smart. That's where, I mean, I'm an economist, that's where computer science is, and that also helps you understand why I'm very particular on the fact that I'm an economist and not a business graduate, right? I didn't study business, I did economics. It's a difference. But of course, this is only university students. I took out the FH students, University of Applied Science in English. But of course, this is sort of for the average degree, right? And then in physics, you have some people who want to be a teacher afterwards. They still study physics. So what's really interesting here is, what's the selection again into something like a PhD? And if we look like people who study medicine, it's also true for economics, unfortunately. We don't find a positive selection into the PhD. So the people who do a PhD, they're probably on average just as smart as the people who don't. Whereas in physics, it's actually the subject with the strongest positive selection into PhDs. It's also true for mathematics. So if I do this slide only for PhDs, the order will change, but I thought this story is a bit better, so I kept the slide as it is. And then the other thing, probably the reason why I was invited to talk, I have to be transparent. And probably also the reason why some of you are in attendance, because there were some rumors beforehand. One exercise that we did, I mean, now we have this fancy algorithm that can score education. And we weren't really in strong contact with TNG before that, but at some point we thought, come on, let's have a little fun, right? Let's crawl a couple of million LinkedIn profiles. Then we take the profiles, we run them through our algorithm, and then we rank the companies by the K-score of their employees. And that's the top 25 companies that we got. Congratulations on being number one. I got the impression that especially being ahead of number two was something that fulfilled a lot of people with a lot of joy and happiness, at least in this room maybe. We also have some other consulting companies in there. The ranking is much longer, it's published. You can look at it. It was just a fun exercise, and media, we did it for ourselves, and then we sent it to a couple of media outlets, and for some reason, lots of newspapers in Germany picked it up, and then someone made it to TNG, and suddenly I had an email, and they asked me whether I want to present this very, very interesting research to the partners, and of course I wanted to, and yeah, that's why I'm here. But again, when we did this research, we were not biased. I mean, now I like you all, but back in the day, I didn't know any of you. Yes. So thanks a lot for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, even though I didn't talk about AI so much. I hope you have some questions. If you want to connect with me, that's gonna put you to my LinkedIn profile. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the great talk, very funny and interesting. And, but you didn't answer your question. Should I go to the mediocre university and be the best, or should I go to the hard one and just swim along?
Now my answer is going to seem as if we sort of discussed that question beforehand. There's not a general answer to that, right? It depends on what mediocre university and how they grade and all of that. If you want the exact data on this, you can go to case-score.com, enter everything, and you'll get the scores. For students, it's free. For companies, it costs a little bit of money, but I think TNG has some scores left. So if you asked someone in HR, they'll help you.
Perfect.
There's not a general answer, right? It depends on the concrete example at hand. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
More questions?
Yes, thanks also for the very interesting talk. One question I have, when you say education pays off 8%, is that like return on investment, and is it discounted for the passage of time between the cost and the payoff in any way? And
yeah, I mean, so we're economists. I mean, it's always, it would be easy to get insulted by that question. Of course it's depreciated for the value of time. Of course it's assuming inflation. Yeah, so it has an 8% return. But of course, that is also strongly driven by the degree, right? There's this effect of accumulating, of learning something, of getting new skills, but this return really jumps around obtaining degrees, right? So if you stop like 1 month before you have your master's degree, the return is going to look very different than, right? It's not linear, it's quite jumpy. But this 8% is very well founded in research, and we also find it for different types of education, right?
That's based on the personal cost or the cost for the whole economy?
That's based on the return. Well, that's based on the total life income, right? And of course, education first reduces that total life income because you're working less, but in the time you're working, you're getting more money. So if you look at the total income and you discount that, then you get the 8%.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
So hey, thanks for the talk. I've got 2 questions. First of all, how do you rank the institutions? Because that doesn't sound easy either. And the second question is, has there been any interest from policymakers to use these findings, for example, for standardizing Abitur scores or something like that, or across borders?
I'm going to start with the second question because it's very easy. The answer is no. We did a study. You can also do this for Abitur grades. It works much better, and also sort of becomes a much better predictor of performance in higher education then. So you could admit students in a much fairer fashion, but the policy side is there's very little interest in education transparency. So a lot of the data that we use, we can only get it by annoying governments with freedom of information requests. So it's sometimes not even public. Now the first question again, please.
Oh yeah, how do you rank the institutions?
Yeah, ideally we try to rank them by the ability of the students that study in those programs. So, for example, if we look at the US, we can work a lot with SATs and these kind of things. In Germany, luckily, we run one of the largest student surveys. So we've sampled more than 500,000 students in Germany. With them, we do a cognitive ability test. That's also the results you saw on one of the last slides where I compared physics with computer science, math, and all of that. So we, luckily for Germany, which is quite a mess, we have really good data ourselves. But that's data we already had as researchers, so we were in the lucky position when we had the idea to do this. We could just pull the data out of the drawer. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So thank you for the talk, first of all. So you were talking a lot about measuring ability or how you can measure ability. How do you measure job performance? Is it reports by the boss, or is it some kind of test, or is it mixed, especially for the meta-analyses where a lot of studies are combined?
Yeah, I mean, again, hard to measure, right? It's sort of an unobservable metric in itself, which is a problem, which is driving down correlations. Maybe everything is better than we will ever know. The usual outcomes are something like salary. That's something you can use nicely across jobs, but everyone will understand that that's not a perfect metric, right? They're really smart people who have a lot of output and they don't earn a lot of money. Other things that you can do within company is you can look at promotional data, you can look at performance reviews, many different things that you can look at. The most convincing argument, in my opinion, is something that looks at a variety of different outcomes and then establishes results for a variety of these outcomes. But yeah, not that easy to do.
Do we have more questions in the room?
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk as well. I was wondering, I feel like in Germany, a lot of people don't only take 6 semesters, for example, for a bachelor's degree. It's fairly common to maybe take 7 or 8, especially in like MINT subjects. Is that also something that went into your sampling of the data and like the return on investment? Or do you just assume that everyone takes 6 semesters for like a bachelor's degree?
Now you're making myself bigger than I am. Most of the studies that I presented are not my studies, right? So a lot of this stuff, it's not my research. It really depends on the study. Normally when they, especially with those causal approaches to estimate the whole thing, they be limited to a very specific situation. If you think about mandatory schooling age, for example, when I said it's 16, you're limited to people who leave school at 16, right? So you're measuring the effect for these people. And then normally the prime target in research is to find a good instrument, to find some exogenous variation, to find something that allows you to establish causality, even if you can't do it for everyone, but at least you have a high quality result for some people. And then multiple studies, they sort of help to convince people that it's true in multiple situations. Whereas if you just run the length of schooling, that will make a difference, right? So in some countries, people just graduate quicker. I said already, a lot of the return is degree-based, right? So whether you have a 8-month degree for a bachelor, 8 semesters for a bachelor degree, or 6 semesters for a bachelor degree, at the end of the day you have a bachelor's degree, right? So it's not going to be perfect, but yeah, 2 more semesters to learn, and of course in MINT the return is again a bit higher because the salaries are a bit higher on average in the labor market. Yeah. It would be easier for me to answer that question sort of with the view of a very particular specific study. In general, it really depends on the estimation strategy that you have. Yeah.
Yeah, hey, thanks a lot for the amazing talk. I was wondering, was there something like super surprising to you? Because in the beginning, you essentially told us, okay, we did a not very complex analysis and it said you get 8% return, and nobody believed that. And I mean, if I ask my grandma, she's probably also gonna say, if you spend another year in university, you're probably gonna get more money. Was there something along the way that like really shocked you or was super unexpected for the community regarding the returns from education?
I think personally I was really just fascinated with the idea of how can you establish causality and what's the return. And when I started this, the more people were still sort of convinced that we overestimate the returns, right? So the fact that we're actually underestimating them, that was a big surprise, not just to me, but probably to lots of education economists. Probably you'll find a smartass who knew from the beginning, but most people were a bit surprised, right? So that was surprising. To me, honestly, what's really driving a lot of my motivation is that people spend a lot of time in education, right? There's a lot of information that we collect in education, right? There's hardly any time in our lives where we're being monitored and evaluated as closely as we are in the educational space, right? There's so much done. And then you look at the outcomes, you look at the GPA, and it doesn't explain shit, right? And I'm an economist, right? That seems very inefficient to me. So that's really the main driver of my motivation is we collect all of this information, how can we get a sort of better signal, a better estimate out of that? And the only solution to that is we have to eliminate some of the noise, right? That's why the talk was called It's a Noisy Signal. And we don't eliminate all of the noise. We eliminate a share of the noise, but we put it to a level where it becomes very usable. And that's something I think is really cool, personally. But I'm biased in that regard.
Let's take one last question. Hi, thanks. So whenever I hear about education, like podcasts, books, whatever, they always say that the model that our education is based on is from the Industrial Revolution, where society was interested in obedient factory workers. And education reform is always pushed in these podcasts, like we need to shift towards creativity, especially in this day and age with AI, where it has strong ability. Maybe the human element is our creative input. Could this lack of correlation with GPA be explained by education not really teaching people how to be productive in our modern day, society?
Unfortunately, I know of zero. I looked for it, so it's not a lack of looking for it. There's hardly any study that establishes a causal link between creativity and job performance, for example. So I also think creativity is really cool, and we can talk a lot about how can we actually measure creativity, because in itself it's a latent variable as well. AI is also super interesting because back in the day, creativity assessments were always very subjective, and now suddenly we can do them with models that sort of produce much more objective results. So there's a lot happening there as well. Fortunately, there's at least to my knowledge, no clear link between creativity and job performance. So I think this argument already has a problem from the start, right? Because there's not this strong link. Is creativity important in education? Very hard to answer for myself. I think it's positively associated. It would be very counterintuitive to think that people who are more creative, because creativity is also associated positively with intelligence, that people who are more creative, that they are worse in education. Would be something that at least would surprise me strongly. Yeah, I hear those arguments as well. And then I'm always happy that I'm an education economist, so I don't really have to work on this level of anecdotal evidence, I sometimes call it, that, well, everyone has an opinion about education, right? Everyone has most of the people know how to make it better, right? And yet we're still waiting for it. So this is really, really hard. It's a super interesting question, but it's really hard to put the finger on it if you want to have like a very quantitative approach to it.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have approached the end of the time slot that has been allocated to us, but thank you for inspiring so many questions. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for coming today. And yeah.
Thank you for listening to me.